Olá, boa noite. Está no ar mais uma edição de Pertinente, programa da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, dedicado a grandes entrevistas com personalidades internacionais da economia, política e sociedade. Hoje iremos estar à conversa com uma conceituada jornalista norte-americana, também médica, especialista em ciência e bioquímica. É correspondente da revista Science e também já colaborou com o New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time, entre outros meios. Lançou há bem pouco tempo um livro sobre a corrida à vacina, intitulado The Vaccine Race, Science, Politics and the Human Costs of Defeating Disease. As vacinas serão mesmo o grande tema deste programa. Iremos aqui falar na corrida à vacina do Covid e também dar um bocadinho de contexto a todo o processo da criação de vacinas e os interesses políticos e geopolíticos também que às vezes podem intrometer nestas corridas. Meredith, greetings from Lisbon. Hope you're doing well. Great to have you on the show. Let's get started with an inevitable question. I know you've been vaccinated. Since there's so much speculation about which one did you have, which one should I get, which one did you have, and how did you feel?
I received both doses of Pfizer vaccine, and I felt just absolutely fine, except that I had a sore arm for about a day after each vaccination.
Okay, glad to hear. Glad that's out of the way. Before we get into COVID and all the factors that led to the vaccines being produced and administered, let's go back and look at the history of vaccines. And from your experience as a medical doctor, as a journalist covering the topic for many years, enlighten us on the importance that vaccines have had historically and whether we've had similar resistance to what we see nowadays to what we should or shouldn't do.
Well, vaccine resistance is basically as old as vaccination itself, which in the modern Western world began with Edward Jenner introducing the smallpox vaccine in 1796. And really, it's evolved the resistance much more in our current era, but it has always been there. Vaccines are probably, along with the sanitation of water, of drinking water, the single biggest public health advance of the 20th century. And it really was the 20th century when vaccines came into full force, particularly after 1955, when Jonas Salk introduced the polio vaccine, the first polio vaccine. And they have led to really the saving of untold millions of lives globally in the, let's say, latter two-thirds of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And they do this by training our immune systems to recognize a foreign pathogen, be it a virus or a bacterium, and to the next time after the vaccination, when you are exposed to that pathogen, your body is ready to pounce on it and shut it down. The really key thing, though, to note is that a vaccination doesn't just protect you, it protects your community. It protects unvaccinated people in your community, because if enough people are vaccinated, a virus or a bacterium just can't get a foothold in the community and spread. So they are a tremendous public good.
And I guess that, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the term herd immunity, that's where it comes from, when you have enough people who are protected, that you can protect that community. Tell us normally how the process of creation of a vaccine works and who's involved normally as far as stakeholders in making something happen.
Well, these days, it is really, by and large, pharmaceutical companies. Sometimes it'll be an academic scientist who develops a vaccine technology in their lab and hands it off to a pharmaceutical company. Back in the day with Jonas Salk in the 1950s, it was much more often, an individual academic scientist who would develop a vaccine and then a company would take it up. Vaccine development is a risky business. It's not that a company like Pfizer or Merck or Moderna just, pulls it out of their pocket and makes bajillions of dollars. It's a long, arduous, not easy, complicated, expensive process, and many, many vaccines fall by the wayside and do not make it to market.
Wow. What, is it because there's a lack of resources many times? Is it because it's not considered important enough, where some virus is not considered important enough for there to be that investment made?
I think there are certainly diseases that predominantly affect the global south where it's difficult to entice a pharmaceutical company into that market because it's not clearly going to pay. And so to spend this 5 or 10 or 20 years developing a vaccine for an impoverished market is not a great incentive. That's why we have foundations and other funders backing vaccine development for diseases that aren't so prominent in the richer developed nations.
Okay, let's get into COVID then, and the process of the creation of this vaccine. Obviously, there was a race for the vaccine with the world trying to come to grips with this virus. How did you see that process happen? And from your experience and expertise, how surprised were you with the influences that were at play, the different countries going at different rates, and then with the results once you achieved the first vaccines that were approved and given to the public?
Well, it was really a fantastic feat to get these vaccines developed as quickly as they were, with one exception, which was the 2009 flu vaccine. Vaccines have virtually never been developed in the kind of time frame that we just saw in the last 15 months. And it's just a tribute to a ton of hard work and international collaboration too. And even though it doesn't appear that way from the outside, a lot of groundwork that was done in the decades leading up to the pandemic moment. These vaccines, particularly, for instance, mRNA vaccines, had been under development, had been experimented with in the lab, and were virtually ready to be tweaked and deployed against COVID. So while it appears like it was, how did they do it so quickly? Well, it didn't come out of nowhere.
Do you think because it came out of, or a lot of people thought that it was very fast and maybe corners were cut, do you think that's a reason why we've seen some of this resistance in large parts of communities and in certain countries, resistance to taking the vaccine?
I think that's some of it, and I think it's understandable. If you're not familiar with the drug and vaccine development process, it could look like, ooh, they must have cut corners because it was done so quickly. In fact, they did not cut corners. They worked very quickly. They spaced vaccine doses close together so that the trials could be conducted quickly, much closer together than in a normal trial. And as I said, they had lots of groundwork that made them ready to go right off the mark. So I don't think that, I'm sorry, I'm losing your earlier question. Can we try that again?
Yeah, of course. If you feel that the fact people are not aware of how fast the process can go, if that contributed to the resistance that was there.
Right. I think that was some of the resistance, or that certainly gave people who were feeling resistant another reason to be hesitant. But I think there was an underlying distrust of, in some cases, of all scientific expertise. And we see this also with climate change and with other issues in this era where everyone's an instant expert, everyone goes and finds what they want to read on the internet, and therefore they don't really need to listen to people who have spent their entire lives studying whatever the issue is. And so I think the speediness of the development may have amplified those concerns, but I think there was a distrust there to begin with, and someone who's hesitant, they're easily manipulated by bad actors who are really exploiting this worry and using social media networks extremely effectively to pass on vaccine misinformation.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, is the manipulation part, because Tell us how deliberate you think that has been and the political influences that could be behind it or the reasons that could be behind it. Because to me, it's absolutely insane that you would propagate lies that damage lives.
I think some of these people are actually completely persuaded of what they are passing on. They're deluded, but they do not think they are passing on lies. Nonetheless, they are. And the end result is the same, with under-vaccinated populations remaining extremely exposed to this virus. So, and then for the deliberate bad actors, I can't speak to their motives. It's just shocking. And how one operates with them is, it's virtually impossible.
Let's role play a little bit here, Meredith. Let's say that I'm skeptical about getting my vaccine. I believe it can hurt me. It can put me at risk. How would you reassure me that it's okay? And regardless which type of vaccine I get, I'll be protected from the different variants, that the risk is worth it. The risk in my mind is worth it.
Well, everything we put in our body has some degree of risk. So it's really important to acknowledge that vaccines are not entirely risk-free. For instance, many people will feel rotten for a day or two after getting a COVID vaccine. That's by and large an indication that it's working, that the immune system is ginning up. And there are very rare but real side effects that can in fact be fatal. And I'll just give you one example. That's the very rare blood clotting disorder that can result from vaccination. It is really important to understand that while that is a real risk, it is far less risky than getting COVID. And to give you one example, there was a deep dive with data in the United Kingdom on the occurrence of this blood clotting disorder per million doses of vaccine administered. And it was about 1.6 million deaths from the blood clotting disorder per million vaccine doses administered. Well, do you know how many deaths per million people there have been in Britain from COVID? It's 1,900. So it's a no-brainer. But you need that kind of careful data and careful explanation with someone who's hesitant. The other thing I'd like to add is it's really important not to dismiss someone with concerns out of hand, but to hear them out and hear what those concerns are. It takes patience, it takes non-judgmental approaches, and it takes a lot of listening.
You talked about truth and people looking for alternative truths that kind of align with what their thoughts or fantasies may be regarding scientific facts and facts overall. Talk to me about how you've seen some of the populist leaders deal with facts and truths, and what's happened not only during Trump's administration in the States, but also what's happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro and the kind of rhetoric that these governments have essentially going against the numbers.
Well, I'd like to begin by pointing out that all populists are not the same. And so you've had populist leaders, for instance, in the Czech Republic and in Hungary, who've taken the vaccine, the pandemic very seriously and implemented strict lockdown measures.
Okay.
So, but of course, the two most prominent are former US President Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro. And they have just done such a grave disservice to their populations. And I think their relationship with the facts is almost completely absent. I mean, they create facts that suit them, so that you had both men dismissing the threat of the pandemic, even after they got coronavirus themselves. You had them undermining their own state authorities' public health measures. You had them promoting false and even harmful therapies like, drinking disinfectant. That was from Donald Trump. And you had them not modeling behavior like mask wearing that really could have saved lives. And so, it would almost be comical to observe these two men were not so grave in the ways that they left their populations really exposed when they could have led and saved many lives by acknowledging the facts and dealing with them.
I think it would be fair to say that the United States, as far as the vaccination process is concerned, has been very agile and very efficient. There were people who have criticized the delay of the European Union in taking action and being faster with their process. What was your view from the US as you looked at Europe and other parts of the world and in the way that vaccination process was managed?
Well, I think it was a bit of befuddlement. It seems like haggling over pricing in a life and death situation like this was short-sighted, and that, insisting on that 27 country bloc being a bloc and not letting nations independently go out and negotiate their contracts and so on was, in the end, did not serve Europeans well. That being said, I'd like to say that everyone was doing their best. People make mistakes. 2020 hindsight is really easy. And, what if the US had charged forward with a vaccine that turned out to be really dangerous? There would be a different kind of second guessing, and the EU would look really good for going a bit slower. So it's all in how people are acting in the moment. And that's very difficult to do with perfection in a really unprecedented situation.
What about the whole patent conversation, Meredith? Where do you stand on that and making it available to all? Is it feasible on a planetary scale to kind of make this this formula available to all and have more countries produce their own?
Well, it's not a single formula. It'll be a different formula for every company. I think that I understand where the gesture comes from, and I also understand why it upsets pharma companies. But the reality is that handing out a recipe for a vaccine, even free of charge, to 2/3 or more of the world's countries is not going to make a difference, because you have to have physical plant, you have to have trained experts, you have to have capacity, you have to have raw materials. These things aren't going to come out of nowhere. And for instance, sub-Saharan Africa with vaccine factories popping up everywhere. So I'm not really persuaded that even if this is done, that it's going to make a huge game-changing difference.
Okay. As far as the whole vaccination production and the race to find those formulas and the solutions, obviously vaccination is also a business. How has it affected the pharmaceutical industry overall and the companies which have been able to reach a conclusion to their creation process?
It's obviously helped certain pharmaceutical companies enormously. They are making billions of dollars. And they also were able, at least in the US, to do it largely risk-free because the US government fronted billions of dollars to these companies to allow them to proceed with development. So you had a company like Novavax, which just had extremely good clinical trial results come out here in the States, that was, trading at less than $10 a share a couple of years ago, and now it's up around $200. A lot of people are getting wealthy, and that's the fact. I'd just like to add that getting wealthy and producing a life-saving vaccine, those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And picking up on what you were saying as well about not every country would have the resources to then develop vaccines or recipes that could be made available. This whole process, do you think it's deepened and accentuated some of the inequalities that we have in the world between the haves and the have-nots?
Oh, absolutely. Both in terms of how the pandemic hit us before we had vaccines. It just revealed terrible underlying structural inequities here in the US in the healthcare system and in the working life system. But now with vaccines on hand and stockpiled in their millions in wealthy countries, and so many countries in the global south lacking sufficient or any access in some cases to vaccines. It's just a stark tragedy that we are watching play out in front of our eyes. And it has done just tremendous harm and needs to be redressed as quickly as it can happen.
And it does seem many times that when certain countries are getting to grips with a particular variant, there is another one that pops up. How many more of these can we expect, in your opinion, and how reassured can people be that the vaccine they have is effective?
Well, fortunately, vaccines seem to be effective against the variants we have seen so far. They lose a little of their effectiveness, but these vaccines are still, by and large, keeping people out of hospitals, keeping them from getting very sick, even with variants. So that piece is reassuring. But this virus is constantly one step ahead of us. And I have no doubt that so long as large unvaccinated populations are out there, either in poorer countries or in pockets in wealthier countries that are vaccine resistant, as long as you have virus multiplying out there, every time a virus replicates, it has a chance to develop a mutation that goes on to be part of a variant that makes people sicker, or it can escape vaccines more effectively than the last one, or that can spread wildly like Delta. And so there is going to be a COVID 5.0 if we consider the first 4 variants like 1 to 4. And there's absolutely no doubt of that. And we need to up our vaccination game. It's the only way to defeat this virus.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, as the virus mutates, as you said, I'm sure new vaccines will also be getting to the market. You talked about the Novavax vaccine in a recent article in June. Would you tell us about that?
Sure. This was kind of a dark horse company that was nearly kicked off the NASDAQ stock exchange several years ago because it was doing so poorly. It had several vaccine failures, but it was developing a technology. It's actually a tried and true technology called protein subunits. It basically means that you deliver a little piece of protein from the virus into the body to stimulate an immune response. And while Moderna and Pfizer and AstraZeneca and J&J got a lot of attention, these are big players, the little dark horse company worked along and finally, after several delays, was able to show really fantastic results in a trial of 30,000 people in North America that was reported out just earlier this month. And so this vaccine is important because its storage requirements are refrigerator. You can take it out of the fridge and have it out for 24 hours and administer it during that 24 hours. That becomes very important in places throughout the globe where there isn't great cold chain, where there isn't, terrific transportation and so on. And so I think this vaccine is going to add to our armamentarium in a really important way globally.
And it's interesting you say that because I have a baby at the moment, so I've been going through the whole vaccination process that you expect when infants are getting protected from viruses that can hurt them. How long do you think it'll take before people look at this vaccine as well as just something else they may have to take, like all the ones that we take now as babies or as youngsters?
I think it's going to take several years for people to get to that level of acceptance, but I do think they will need to, because this virus isn't going away. Even if we beat back the pandemic, it's not going to be something we wipe out like smallpox. It's going to be there bubbling along in the background, and we're going to need booster doses from time to time as adults. It'll, I imagine, become part also of a childhood vaccine schedule at some point. It'll be a lot like flu, I'm anticipating, for adult populations as a vaccine you get every winter to beat off something that could otherwise do nasty things to your body.
And as we start to look at the macro kind of vision for what has happened during these last 2 years, What do you hope people have learned from this process in dealing with the pandemic? Because surely this won't be the last one. So what findings are there that we really need to take in order to learn how to do it better next time?
I think that governments particularly need to build long-term for the next pandemic. You know, as human beings, we're very bad about dealing with high impact, low probability events. So there's every chance that this pandemic recedes and then we go back to business as usual, which is, at least in this country and in many others, underfunding public health, underfunding things like surveillance systems, which means that you are constantly out in the environment sampling new diseases or sampling infectious disease cases, sequencing, reading their genetic code to see, you know, is this a new virus or is this a virus that's mutating in a dangerous way? We need to have eyes on the ground all around the world. And just to give you an example of how skewed it is right now, about 60% of the nearly 2 million or perhaps more than 2 million coronavirus sequences, that's a readout of all 29,900 letters of the virus's genetic code. The number of those sequences available, roughly 2 million, 60% of those are from the United States or the United Kingdom that scientists can go study. And so we are like blind to what's going on in many areas of the world. We need to get infrastructure out there that will allow us going forward to have eyes on the ground in terms of infectious disease surveillance in these countries, which is going to be, in all likelihood, where the next pandemic emerges.
Meredith, I'd like to close our interview with a series of quick-fire questions, which we always put to our guests. And in one or two sentences, I'd like you to try to answer these, even though it'd be very easy to take longer than that. But in a couple of sentences, tell us when we can safely say that the COVID pandemic has been contained. Look into your informed crystal ball and tell us.
When it becomes a yearly event that you get vaccinated for each fall, for instance, and it's a manageable disease as opposed to one that's managing us.
Looking at the experience you have associating with leaders, with experts, what is one quality, personality trait that leaders dealing with this issue really should have or could benefit from having?
Humility.
It's a good one. What is the biggest challenge humanity faces in the next decade from your perspective?
Addressing climate change is definitely the biggest challenge for our species and our planet.
And to finish, if you could change one thing in the world today by magic, and I guess we'll keep it to the topic we've been discussing over the last half an hour or so. If you could change one thing in the industry and in issues related to the pandemic, what would it be?
The wealthier nations would immediately donate their excess COVID vaccine stockpiles to the nations that are so in need of these vaccines, and they do it quickly and efficiently and without charge.
Look, I think it's the perfect way to conclude this conversation, Meredith. When it comes to equality, when it comes to inclusion, we've definitely learned that there's so much to be done for all of us to have the same rights, and it goes beyond sometimes those that we take for granted, and especially when we're talking about a pandemic and the ability to deal with it from a global perspective. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for informing our public, because information is important, facts are important, and they should come from the experts. So once again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks, Pedro. I was happy to do that.
Fantastic. Foi na verdade privilégio falar com a doutora Meredith Wadman, que acho que Passou aqui informação muito pertinente para todos nós que estamos neste processo agora de vacinação e imunização contra o vírus Covid. Foi interessante ouvir um bocadinho a história daquilo que tem sido o processo de vacinação referente a outros vírus, a outras doenças, e nós estamos, na verdade, num processo de aprendizagem a lidar com este vírus e a combater este vírus de uma forma não só nacional, mas global, e a Meredith também falou na importância de ter mais igualdade e mais oportunidades para todos, para aí sim conseguirmos ultrapassar este grande desafio. Foi mais uma interessante edição do programa Pertinente, porque, como sabe, quando há factos, há argumentos.